My name is Lionel Young, and I serve as the Executive Vice President for Global Action and also work as one of the lecturers in our program. I've been in leadership for about 35 years. Most of those years were in pastoral ministry. The first congregation I led was a church of less than 100 people in a rural part of the Midwest in the United States. I also led a very large congregation near the city of Chicago. And I've learned a lot of things about leadership. And in my present role, I've learned a lot of things about leadership. Yet I think this course may be one of the most difficult courses for a Western person to teach in a non-Western context. I've discovered that there are many principles that can be translated from one culture to another. But there are cultural nuances that make it difficult to speak, at least sometimes, with authority in another culture. As such, we've tried to focus in this manual on principles that we find in Scripture, those that can be translated across all cultures. But we want to encourage teachers to contextualize this material to help students become more effective leaders. In preparation, you may want to think about just writing down some of your own leadership experiences, some of the things that you have learned serving as a leader in your culture. You may want to think about some of the things that you have learned from other leaders in your culture, or some of the things that you have learned from reading widely on the subject of leadership. And then, of course, reading through the materials themselves and reading about some of the biblical figures that we talk about in this manual. This is not intended to be an exhaustive course on leadership. We're going to be learning about leadership our entire lives. I'm still learning about leadership, but it is intended to give you some biblical figures that you can look at and put some, I like to say, put some flesh on some of the lessons that you have learned from leadership. So we want to encourage you, draw from your experiences, draw from your reading, and then use the biblical text to flesh out what you have learned about leadership over the years. I think this should be a highly interactive class. I like to say that we're often good at answering questions that no one is asking, and I want to encourage you not to do that in this course. Your students are at different places in their leadership development, and so you want to interact with them and find out what questions they are asking and where they are. And as you've heard our dean mention in one of the training videos, every class is different. You're going to have some classes where students are going to be very mature and they're going to be more experienced in leadership. Some are going to be very, very young and have less experience. And so you may want to emphasize, depending on your class makeup, some aspects of this course. You may want to place a greater emphasis on those aspects to serve your students well. In the introduction, we talk about 6 things that shape every leader. First of all, the culture around us. Whether we realize it or not, we all have ideas about leadership that are conditioned by culture. And when you move from one culture to another, you begin to see this more clearly. But it usually requires a great deal of critical reflection to see how culture has influenced us. I remember, as an American, going to Kenya with my wife and living on the campus in the lodgings for visiting professors. And in the evenings, my wife and I would take walks to the other side of the campus where the students and families lived. And we would talk with students. We'd have tea with them, chat with their kids. Our boys would play basketball with some of the young students in our class. And after a couple of weeks, someone came to me and wanted to know why I was spending time with the students. And I really didn't understand the question, because I thought that's what African leaders did. They hung out with the students, and they said, no, that really isn't what African leaders do, because people in positions of influence and authority do not usually just walk around the campus and spend time with the students. And so I began to apologize because I thought I was doing something that was culturally taboo. And they said, "Oh, no, this is good for us. It's just different." It's good for African leaders to understand that you can spend time with the people that you serve, actually hang out with them, and it's a good example to us. And so, my wife and I became well known throughout the campus as the professor that liked to spend time with the students. There was something about my leadership style that was actually challenging ideas that were embedded in some African contexts. However, I was also challenged by things within African culture about leadership styles. I value efficiency, which means not wasting too much time chit-chatting about all kinds of things like the weather and the garden and the chickens and the family, and I'm not exaggerating. And I had to learn to slow down. And my demand for promptness and efficiency seemed rather impersonal. Efficiency was not a bad thing, but the most important thing for Africans is relationship. So if tea break goes a little bit longer so I can finish my story and talk about the pain and suffering I'm going through in my life, that's okay. In fact, that's preferable. And what I learned was that if I took time at the beginning of meetings or classes or other gatherings to just enjoy the people I was with, I would actually be able to get more done. Culture shapes us, and sometimes in very subtle ways. Second, our sense of calling is vitally important. I would describe calling as a strong God-given desire that is also affirmed by others. A 16th century reformer named John Calvin talked about calling he talked about the inner call and the outward call. The inner call is something that I feel God is doing in my heart, that clearly He's calling me into leadership in some way. The outward call is the community of God coming and if you will, figuratively laying their hands on us and saying, yes, we see in you the ability to provide leadership. And we come back to the sense of calling again and again and again as leaders. The community around us that affirms our calling also shapes us. I'm in my early 50s, and my life is still being shaped by the people around me who encourage me, who challenge me, who counsel me, who push back on me, and even at times frustrate me. That can be good because God uses the community to shape us and help us become more effective leaders. Of course, our walk with the Lord, our communion with God, our time of prayer, of reading, reflection. Remember, Jesus was a very busy leader in Mark chapter 1, and yet He took time to get away from the crowds and spend time with His Father. This is vitally important. It's vitally important that we teach our students to make time for this because this shapes us as a leader. Conflict also shapes us as much as we do not like it. We must learn to navigate through it, and we do talk some about it in this course. And I would say we bring our personalities to conflict. Here I would say understand your personality and teach students to understand their own personality. We'll talk about that in a few moments. To know what their tendencies are. Some students maybe, conflict, they want to, just run away from it. Others want to run right to it. I can say that I am by nature a diplomat. I like to help people work their problems out until someone says or does something that I perceive as a personal attack. And then I can say and do things that are not really all that helpful. I know that that's a weakness of mine. It's something that I've had to work on over the years. I know that about myself, and I'm getting better at it. I'm much better at it than I used to be. Some people naturally love conflict, and I don't really understand those kind of people, but some people do. And for those leaders, I'm just going to say life is going to be really, really hard unless they let the Spirit of God change them. We are called to be peacemakers. Some people go out of their way to avoid conflict, and there is much that is attractive about this personality. But in the end, conflict is unavoidable, and they too will have to learn the hard way that avoiding conflict will not make life better. Conflict shapes us, and I want to encourage you to help your students to see that conflict is an opportunity to grow as leaders. And of course, the commonplace or the everyday shapes us as leaders. One of my favorite writers is an American pastor named Tim Keller, and he uses an expression that goes something like this: we shape our work, but our work also shapes us. That God can use the everyday routines of life to shape us as leaders. Leaders are gifted by God, but they should, you may recall Paul's words to Timothy, fan into flame the gift that God has given them, taking the gifts that God has given us and developing those. Just like a young athlete, a soccer player, a baseball player, may be naturally gifted, but they need to take those skills and develop them. In the same way, we have been gifted by God to be leaders, to serve the church, but we need to take those gifts and develop them. In this sense, perhaps the most important characteristic of an effective leader is humility, which begins with the recognition that I'm gifted by God, but I'm deeply flawed, and I desperately need God and the community to help me become a more effective leader. I love what Paul said to Timothy, and this is a line I would use with your class. He said you should give yourself, and I'm paraphrasing here in the first part of the line, to your calling, so that, and here's the precise quote, that everyone may see your progress. I remember one of my mentors saying to me, Lionel, the people in your congregations should say, our pastor is a different man than he was a year ago. I see his progress. I see his growth. And not only is that important for you as a leader, you are being an example to the congregation you serve. That when they see you growing, they should be following your example. You should be saying to them, and you should be growing too. That we're all growing to become more like Christ. I think one of the other things I would say here is, by way of introduction, is that remember that leaders are different. And you could have fun here with some personality tests maybe in your classes. There's all kinds of personality tests. There's DISC tests. There's the 16 personality tests, Myers-Briggs tests. These are all available online. There's all kinds of unique personality tests. And they're not gospel to me, but they're interesting to me because they show that leaders are different. I'm a much quieter leader. I'm a very introspective leader. I like to think about problems and think and reflect on them very carefully. I'm more of a thought leader, but I also, that's a different kind of leader than the leader that, walks in the room and just takes over the room. And that leader is necessary too, but it doesn't mean that one leader is more effective. It may be that God has called leaders to different places in ministry. And so keep that in mind, so with your students, some of them, they're all different and unique, and call out the leader in them, but that doesn't mean that they all have to look the same. Shape them into the person that God wants them to be, and help them become more effective leaders. We do talk in our first chapter about Jesus. He is the perfect leader. And I want to emphasize that he's the only perfect leader. And none of us are going to be perfect leaders. And I want to stress something that's mentioned in this first chapter. Almost everywhere we look in the world today, people are consumed with image. What they look like, what people think of them, how they look on social media, how many likes they get. And I call this image management. There's just a lot of image management in our culture today. Now, there is absolutely nothing wrong with being self-aware, and a few people could probably use a lot more self-awareness. So there's nothing wrong with this at all. But we live in a world where there really is too much focus on image management. and not enough focus on character development. And I'm saying this as someone that spends time in the Western world and in the non-Western world, and much of it perhaps has come from the Western world. But there's just so much focus on image management. I would encourage you to challenge your students to place a greater emphasis on character development. Being the person that God wants you to be. People will be drawn to that kind of leader. Character issues like integrity, like hard work, perseverance, humility, generosity, the ability of a leader to listen, sacrificial love, compassion, faithfulness, excellence, honesty, trustworthiness, on down the list. These character issues are so vitally important. And I think that if we encourage our students to really focus on character, the image thing will take care of itself over time. I would emphasize this as a lecturer. Remember that our character is more important than our image, and character development is more important than image management. We talk about Jesus as the perfect leader, and there are so many lessons we can learn from this. I want to mention one other thing as it relates to Jesus, and that is his life as an incarnational leader. His leadership was highly relational. Think about the incarnation. Jesus became human. He did not lead from a distance. He did not save us from a distance. He entered into our world. In fact, we even use that turn of phrase in English. We talk about entering into someone else's world. And Christians should know exactly what this means, because this is exactly what Jesus did. He came, he became one of us. He ate our food. He wore our clothing. He spoke our language. He became part of human culture and became part of his culture. And I think, perhaps for younger students, this may be sort of a natural thing. They understand, they get it. Well, yeah, of course we want to spend time with the people that we serve. But as you progress in leadership, and perhaps as you lead a larger ministry, it becomes more tempting to withdraw from people. And I would encourage you to encourage your students that, yes, we do need times to withdraw, but we must always be present with the people that we serve. And you can even ask, this would be a good discussion item, to how can we be present with the people that we serve, and how can we do that even in a large ministry? So, for example, when I was in a very small congregation, that was an easy thing to do. When I was in a very large congregation, how did I do that? How does one make himself available, recognizing he or she cannot be available to everyone? There are still ways one can do that. We've organized this discussion around biblical characters, and I'm not going to cover all of the things that is found in the course. We cannot, even the course itself is not exhaustive, but I want to highlight a few lessons that I think are important for me as I look at this course and as I've been serving as a leader for many years. These biblical figures can put some flesh on these lessons for us. One of the first lessons that is abundantly clear from this manual is that almost every leader will have times when they feel inadequate for doing what God has called them to do. And this is clearly illustrated in the life of Moses. And I think that, we look at Moses, he was a gifted leader, and yet he resisted the initial call of God because he felt inadequate. And every leader I know has struggled with this, and I think it's appropriate for you to share some of your feelings of inadequacy as a leader, because that models something for the students that says, look, you may have times of inadequacy, that's okay, times of fear, times of struggle, but God can still use you. Again, every leader I know has these feelings of inadequacy, and yet leaders can still be used in a great way. Second, effective leaders are good at asking others to help them carry the load. And we see this illustrated throughout, not only in Moses' ministry or leadership, but throughout the biblical papers. Think of Exodus chapter 18. Moses, remember, his father-in-law says, look, you're going to wear yourself out by the way you're leading, and the people are going to get tired of this. It's evidence in the life and ministry of Jesus. He chooses 12 to be with him, and he pours his time and energy into them. And even he pours more energy into Peter, James, and John. He was very intentional. We see this in Acts 6 as the church is growing. The apostles realize they need help. It was affecting the growth and health of the church. They appoint leaders to help oversee the work. This is seen in the ministry of the apostle Paul, and who poured his life into people like Timothy and Titus. This is the way the kingdom of God grows. And I would encourage you to help your students see that this has to be very intentional, that we are seeking out people that we see that God has gifted, and we're calling them out, and we're inviting them to be with us, and we're helping pour into their lives so that they can become more effective leaders. This is the way to grow the kingdom of God. Again, this has to be very intentional, because ministry can be very demanding. When we're doing weddings and we're doing funerals and we're doing pastoral care and we're preparing sermons, it is important that, like Jesus, we set aside an intentional time to pour our lives into leaders. The third thing is a takeaway from me from our manual is that all leaders are going to face times of opposition and discouragement. Every single leader will. One of my friends who led a very large ministry not far from where I was a pastor said, every time he went into a coffee shop, there was probably someone in that coffee shop that didn't like him, and probably someone in that coffee shop that really loved him. And he just learned that that was just part of leadership. And he's a very effective leader and a very godly man. We see this in the life of Moses. We see this also in the life of Elijah. We see this in the ministry of the Apostle Paul. Leaders sometimes are viewed as a threat because they're changing the status quo. And sometimes people like things just the way they are, and they're doing just fine, thank you very much, with the way the church has always been or the way the organization is always run. In fact, your leadership may feel like a threat to them because you're going to be bringing about change in the church or change in the organization that you serve. Sometimes people are jealous, and we see this in the life and leadership of Moses. People who may want your position. This is something that I discovered later in ministry. I was rather naive to this. I thought, why would anyone want to do what I'm doing? and it is ironic, is it not, that Moses didn't even want to do what God was calling him to do, and yet other people wanted his position. And so they felt threatened by him. There may be all kinds of reasons for opposition, but understand you are not alone as a leader, and you must help your students understand that they are going to face opposition and they will have times of discouragement. This is pretty normal as a leader. One of the things our manual points out is a leader by the name of Barnabas, who was a constant source of encouragement to people around him. Leaders should be a source of encouragement. Teach your students to encourage the people around them, to say thank you, to say it often, to help them persevere in difficult times, to identify areas of strengths in other people, and learn to say the words, this is something you're really good at. God has blessed you in this area, and I want to encourage you to continue to use this gift that God has given you. That is very, very powerful. The fifth thing that jumps out from this manual is that leadership requires us to hear the voice of God and follow in faith, and we see this clearly in the life of Abraham. Though he wasn't perfect, and there are many examples of his imperfections, he was a person of faith. The sixth thing that really jumps out from this manual is that authentic leadership is about using your position and influence to bless and serve others. And we see this modeled for us by the life of a female leader, Esther. She used her position not for herself. She rejected what our manual calls the shadow mission, a personal agenda, that I'm in this for something I'm going to get out of it. Now, certainly, there are many blessings from being a leader. I'm not saying that one cannot be blessed in serving as a position of leadership. But Esther saw her position for such a time as this. This is why I'm here. I'm here to serve others. I'm here to bless others, even if it costs me my own life. And this reminds me of the words of a great leader named Winston Churchill, who served during World War II. He said, "I'm prepared for martyrdom, but I prefer that it be delayed." And I love that turn of phrase, because he's saying, look, I'm prepared to lose my life, but look, I'm not heading out to lose my life. I'm going in this to serve others and to make a difference. But at the end of the day, if I lose my life while doing it, then I'm prepared for it. And I think this was Esther's approach. She didn't want to die. That wasn't her goal. Her goal was to save as many lives as possible. But if that's what God wanted, she was open to that. If I die, if I perish, I perish. Because my goal is to use this position that God has given me to serve other people. And I think if that becomes a core conviction for our students, they will be very effective leaders to say, look, God's given me position, not so others can serve me. He's given me position so that I can serve others. I love the example of Daniel, who, and our manual talks about how he learns to navigate through his culture. I think this is vitally important, especially for students who are living in places that are very difficult to serve Christ. Daniel learned how to live in his culture. He wasn't provocative, something that Christian leaders need to learn. We should not be trying to draw attention to ourselves as what some people call culture warriors. Again, when I led a very large church in a small community, I remember the mayor, the chief of police, the prosecutor, and other officials were members of the congregation I served. And I made occasional appearances at functions. I didn't love doing it, but I did it because I wanted to serve the people in my congregation. But sometimes reporters, I would receive calls from the newspaper or the reporters, and I was conveniently unavailable to give comments on things. And my assistant knew to say, hey, if you have questions, he's not available now, but if you want to send your questions, we'll try to respond to them. And we'd respond to them sometimes in writing and ignore the ones that we didn't want to respond to. Because I didn't want to be pulled into culture wars. That was not my calling. I want to be as wise as possible. Daniel was very careful, very respectful, very wise in how he navigated through Babylonian culture. I think this is an important lesson for students to learn, to be as wise as they possibly can in their culture. He was so exceptional that he was promoted to high office in Babylonian culture. But he was also a person of conviction. If need be, he was willing to suffer for his faith. And then we see in the ministry of the Apostle Paul someone who modeled how to handle conflict. As a leader, you will face conflict, and we talked about this at the outset, and you want your students to know this. They're going to face conflict. Every leader will face conflict. Help students see conflict as an opportunity to grow. Now, sometimes I want to say to the Lord, look, I don't need so many growth opportunities, but He does provide many opportunities. This is an opportunity to become more like Christ. Help students see conflict as an opportunity to serve. I might not like conflict, but we're called to serve, and we must get involved for the sake of others. Help students grow in wisdom as they help others manage conflict. There are some things that are very wise to do, but there are some things that are very unwise to do. I learned early on that when two businessmen come to you from your church and they have a conflict and they want you to get involved in it, be very wise. This is but one example. There's a wise way to handle that and an unwise way to handle that. Certainly, sit down, have coffee, listen as a pastor, but stay focused on pastoral issues. Then sit down with the other person and listen. They'll want to tell you everything about the whole problem. And you listen and you love them and say, I can tell you want to follow Christ. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to appoint someone to help you work through these issues. They'll report to me and I'll be praying for you on a regular basis. And you appoint someone to do that. You don't jump in the middle of that. But this is but one of many examples Wise leaders know how to navigate through conflict and do that well and help people become more like Christ. And then I would mention the importance of vision, and this is from the chapter from Nehemiah, and there's too much in that chapter for me to kind of cover the whole chapter, but I am a big fan of visions-based and values-based leadership, that we lead other people with vision and calling people back to the vision of the organization. And sometimes that helps people get out of the weeds, to say, okay, you know what we're about is equipping leaders around the world. And it draws people into a larger mission and a larger vision. I'll give you an example. Saying next year we want to raise $1,000 is not as powerful as saying next year we want to help 10 children living in poverty receive the food and education they need and help them hear about the love of Christ. So we've got, that's the difference between just vision and just saying we want to raise $1,000. Vision also helps us stay really, really focused. You can help students think about vision and help them become visionary leaders, writing down vision, writing down their values. These are just a few of the practical things that come out of our manual. And I would encourage you to have very practical advice as leaders. Give them help on how to manage schedule, how to stay healthy spiritually, physically, and emotionally. Using the biblical characters, you may want to use other biblical characters that are not mentioned in the manual, but using them to put flesh on this course on leadership. Tying all of this together will be a challenge. I think if you can get the students to come away with a few just like takeaways, that will be the best thing you can do. Also remind them again and again, there is only one perfect leader, and that leader is Jesus Christ. That's how we start the course. One perfect leader. All the other leaders are flawed, and yet God will use you as a flawed leader, just as He used me as a flawed leader, and He will use your students as flawed leaders to bring the grace of God and the good news of Jesus Christ to